Joan Baez was born on January 9, 1941, in Staten Island, New York, in a Quaker household, her family eventually relocating to the Southern California area. Of Mexican and Scottish descent, Baez was no stranger to racism and discrimination. The family moved around with Albert Baez's work, and they were living in a suburb of Buffalo, New York, while he worked on a research project for the military, when they discovered they had a neighbor who thought the color of their skin made it necessary to drop that racial slur that will not be repeated. That's downright awful, and when they moved to California, things got even worse. When young Joan found her school divided into strictly segregated groups, it had a deep impact on her. When she spoke with CBS Sunday Morning around the release of her documentary, she was heartbreakingly candid about the fact, including her memories of being sexually assaulted by her father as a child. She said the calmness she embraced while on stage was the exact opposite of what she actually felt, and that much of that inner turmoil was caused by something that both she and her sister came to remember as adults. She described it as a sexual inappropriateness that remained partially obscured by the shadows of time, memory, and trauma. Baez went on to say that she felt it was a secret she needed to keep until the deaths of both her parents and her sister, and said that coming forward was to start the healing process. In a conversation with Variety, she said that hearing recordings of her father's denial was one of the hardest parts of making the documentary. 2 years after her family moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, so that her professorial father could join the faculty of MIT, Baez enrolled at Boston University's theater school, greatly disliking the experience and flunking her courses. She eventually delved into the city's burgeoning folk scene, later citing artists like Harry Belafonte, Odetta. Baez referred to the singer as her goddess in a 1983 Rolling Stone interview, and Pete Seeger as major influences. Soon Baez became a regular performer at local clubs and eventually got her big break via an appearance at the 1959 Newport Folk Festival, invited on stage by Bob Gibson. She told The Telegraph that although she'd gotten her start playing in small coffee houses, she wasn't prepared for it when Bob Gibson brought her up on stage for one of his concerts. It looked like the largest gathering of people on earth, she recalled. She felt as if she would been invited to her own execution. At that point, she hadn't been considering music as a serious pursuit for long. She was 13 years old when she saw Pete Seeger perform at a benefit concert, and she cites that as the moment that changed everything for her. Baez released her self-titled debut album on Vanguard Records, featuring tracks like House of the Rising Sun and Mary Hamilton. Baez became renowned for her distinctive voice while receiving press billing that she would see as evoking the Virgin Mary and Madonna archetype. She released several albums during the first half of the decade, followed by more studio outings like Farewell, Angelina, and Noel. Not long after her debut dropped, she met the then-unknown singer and songwriter Bob Dylan. Baez was a pivotal force in helping Dylan gain access to the thriving folk scene. In turn, performing his songs gave her a form of artistic expression that synced with her hands-on activism. The duo had a romantic relationship for a time, though the union had reached its end by the 1965 tour, which resulted in Dylan refusing to invite Baez on stage. Drugs and the 1960s go hand in hand. Were they on restaurant menus? Absolutely no one would be surprised if they were. Still, Joan Baez has been honest about the fact that she had little interest in the drug culture of the time, and in an interview with Rolling Stone, she said that although she did try some, she said that she was almost always the odd one out. The 1960s were a turbulent time in American history, and Baez often used her music to express her social and political views. Baez thus became an established, revered folk artist who used her voice for widespread change. Baez continued to be active politically and musically in the 1970s. She helped establish the West Coast branch of Amnesty International, a human rights organization, and released numerous albums, signing with A&M and branching out beyond folk. The decade also brought Baez big chart success with a remake of the band's The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, which in 1971 became a top 10 hit in the UK and a top 5 hit in the US. In 1975, Baez released the acclaimed Diamonds and Rust, which featured the top 40 title track that delved into her relationship with Dylan. The album also offered other songs penned by Baez like Winds of the Old Days and the Joni Mitchell duet Dida, as well as a remake of a Stevie Wonder tune, Never Dreamed You'd Leave in Summer. She rounded out the decade with Gulf Winds, Blowin' Away, and Honest Lullaby. Joan Baez was, of course, involved in a high-profile relationship, then split with Bob Dylan, and she's been open about how much the end of the relationship hurt. That makes it sort of weird, then, that one of her less well-known relationships was with the decidedly Dylan-obsessed Steve Jobs. In one biography written about him, reviewed by Rolling Stone, Steve Wozniak shared their penchant for collecting Dylan bootlegs. Then, in the early 1980s, Jobs and Baez started dating. Did it have anything to do with the fact that Dylan was her ex? Jobs' friend, Elizabeth Holmes, seemingly confirmed that he loved that connection to Dylan. The relationship lasted for a few years, and if it seems like the wildly empathetic Baez and the notoriously, well, not empathetic Jobs were an odd couple, she admitted that exact thing in an interview for Rolling Stone. While the 80s and 90s were a time where Baez reflected on her place in a trendy musical landscape that often didn't honor folk, she nonetheless continued to perform at benefits and fundraisers for social and political causes around the world. She also maintained her recording output with albums like Speaking of Dreams, 1989, and Ring Them Bells, 1995. Her first album of the new millennium was 2003's Dark Chords on a Big Guitar, followed up by a collection of live tracks in 2005 on Bowery Songs, featuring tracks by Dylan and Woody Guthrie as well as traditional folk. Baez was honored with a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2007. Baez released Day After Tomorrow, her 24th studio album, in 2008, with the project produced by Steve Earle. Joan Baez may be retired from the stage, but that doesn't mean she's ridden off into the sunset, never to be heard from again. In 2020, she spoke with Rolling Stone about her new way of carrying on the tradition of activism and awareness that she's long been known for. Baez has started to paint portraits of people she respects, and at the time of the writing, she had featured personalities like Kamala Harris, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Martin Luther King Jr., and Dwayne Johnson. She shared that she felt fortunate to be able to have an art studio at her home where she could spend a few hours a day painting, before spending time with her menagerie of animals and still hoping to inspire sweeping change. While activism and change is a theme for her when it comes to choosing subjects for her portraits, she says there's something else important in there, too, a willingness to take risks. In January 2016, Baez hosted a concert at New York's Beacon Theater in honor of her 75th birthday, with an array of guests like Judy Collins, David Crosby, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Jackson Browne, the Indigo Girls, and Paul Simon. The event was released as an album later in the year. Baez has released the memoirs Daybreak, 1968, and A Voice to Sing With, 1987. In 2009, PBS also released an American Masters documentary on Baez's life, How Sweet the Sound.